Welcome to the UCSF Sports Medicine Podcast, 6 to 8 weeks, Perspectives in Medicine. During our program, we continue to cover a variety of hot topics in the sports medicine world and more.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of 6 to 8 weeks, Perspectives on Sports Medicine. I'm joined by Dr. Brian Feeley and Dr. Nirav Pandya. I'm Dr. Drew Lansdown. Today, we're going to talk about early sports specialization. So this is a topic that we all encounter regularly in our clinical practice. It's something we hear a lot about in the news and sports media, but it's a really important topic in trying to understand the effects of sports participation in our younger athletes and how that translates into their injury risk, their enjoyment of their activities, and then how that translates to professional athletes as well. So maybe, Nirav, starting with you, how do you define early sports specialization, and what exactly is this topic that we're talking about today?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a lot of people kind of hear this term but don't know exactly what it means. So really, it's the playing one sport year round at the exclusion of other sports. And I think where there's a little bit of kind of debate is at what age is it considered just you're concentrating on one sport versus you're specializing too early. And I think for most of us, it's up until the high school age. So if you decide to play one sport before you become a freshman in high school, before the age of 14, I would consider that early sports specialization. I think most of us see that by 14 or 15, if you are playing one sport, that's appropriate and that injury risk isn't there. But where I really get concerned about is that under 14 age group where that 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12-year-old is deciding, I'm going to play baseball year round, I'm going to play soccer year round, and not, number one, not play other sports, and also number two, not take rest even if they are doing one sport. So I think it's a combination both of doing one activity and then doing too much of that one activity where the risks come in.
And Brian, what sports do you typically see this the most in? Just in seeing patients, talking to parents with kids, and maybe your own kids as well.
Yeah, I think it's really region specific, and obviously that's based on weather. And I love talking about weather, but we'll focus on region. So in the Bay Area, that's soccer, volleyball. Depending on how different sports teams are doing, that can be basketball. So more recently, it's been because the Warriors are doing well, or we're doing well, maybe we'll do well again. We see an uptick in basketball, both for boys and girls. And then for a while, with the Giants doing well, it was baseball and softball. In the Northeast and in the North, hockey has always been a sport where people will consistently be considered at risk, especially because when kids play at a very young age, they're at high risk for developmental changes in their hip and femoral acetabular dysplasia or femoral acetabular impingement. And then other sports that are gaining in popularity, so particularly lacrosse and field hockey in certain regions have become increasingly popular. And then there are other sports where it's really encouraged to start early and then compete to the exclusion of others. So swimming comes up, some other high-risk ones like running, where you can really compete in multiple different sports year-round. The other thing that should be brought up is that there are some sports that it is beneficial sometimes that your peak may be early on. So like gymnastics, rhythmic gymnastics, your peak may be at 15 or even 14, 15, 16. So that is something that your window might close for some of these athletes so early that you just have to frame shift relatively early. But that's the exception, not the rule.
Yeah, and I think it's something that oftentimes it feels like it starts so innocuously, like the kids are really interested in it, and it's like, well, yeah, let's keep playing soccer. And it's like, yeah, we'll roll right into the next season. But why do we worry about it? Like, what's the problem? Like, the kid likes it, the parents are into it. Like, is it something to worry about?
Yeah, I think, the thing that I think most parents at least got a grasp on, I think that's changed from, 10 years ago, is that they understand that sports specialization is associated with increased injury risk. You're more likely to get an ACL tear. You're more likely to get overuse injuries. So you're more likely to end up in, the ped sports medicine clinic because you're doing one sport repetitively again and again and again, and you're training like an adult. So I think that people will understand that. I think that the two facets that people don't necessarily kind of understand is that early sports specialization does lead to burnout. About 70% of kids will drop out by age 13 who specialize early simply because sports aren't fun anymore, and that's kind of a crazy age when we look back on our various athletic kind of careers. It's like middle school is when you really started taking things seriously. You shouldn't be dropping out. And I think the third thing, and this is the thing that parents are most surprised about, is that they feel that even if they know there's an injury risk, even though they know there's burnout, they feel like, look, the only way I'm going to get better or make it to the next level is if I specialize. And actually, if you look at people who specialize, even from like a motor skill standpoint, if you play multiple sports, you're more likely to be a better athlete. You're more likely to be coordinated. You're more likely to be better in terms of gross motor skills. And if you look at kind of elite performance, the vast majority of people who make it to college and, the high elite levels are more likely to specialize later. So I think it's this combination of it increases injury risk, increases burnout, and decreases performance. And that's the reason why specialization just isn't a good idea for these kids.
Yeah, I think the data is fascinating on this because it's really, really well borne out, and you can see it happen in your kids because all of us have kids. They all play sports, and you can see it in the field-based sports, especially. So you watch the soccer kids, and the ones that are good at field presence are good at field presence in soccer, and then they become good at field presence in they become good at field presence in basketball. They can become good at field presence in lacrosse, and that's called skill transference. And so that ability to transfer across different sports and then develop that little subtle differences. You can take what you're good at in one sport and bring it across, actually makes you better in the other sport. And you think, okay, well, has that been studied? It's been studied and it's been proven. So you can use that to convince parents in clinic that it actually is beneficial to do that. And sometimes I feel like when we're in clinic, the parents don't actually believe us with this stuff, but it's been proven over and over and over again that the science is there. You will get better at your primary sport by playing other sport with that skill transference, not only with the actual physical skill sets, but also with that ability to transfer the skill and the visual perception and your ability to have that like depth and that transfer of the skill from one sport to the other will make you a better athlete in that other sport.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to highlight, just that, that skill development, that skill transfer, and then pairing that with that lower rate of burnout, like just getting totally beaten down by that sport and losing interest. It's like you can maintain interest, you can get better, you can have more fun, and probably have a lower injury rate too by just spreading out what you're doing. I know we've talked about it a lot, on this podcast, and something that we bring up in clinic when we're seeing patients and talking to families, but it's such like an important message to take. I have a question
for Nirav. How do you, when you're in clinic, how do you sniff out when a kid is getting burnt out with a sport? Because you probably see it a lot. You see a lot of 11, 12, 13-year-olds. And for me, I see like really aggressive parents. And then I can kind of get a sense looking at the kid, but I'm usually dealing with high school athletes. And high school athletes are usually already kind of declared one way or another. How do you sniff it out in the pre-adolescent kids?
Yeah. I think aggressive parents, number one, typically the parents are the ones kind of running the visit more so like than just describing their, like the injury, but just like really running, talking about timelines, talking about when they need to play. And if I see a kid who doesn't seem excited about playing, isn't really engaging in these kind of conversations, I get a little bit worried. And then a lot of times what I'll do is I'll kind of have I'll have the kid kind of go and kind of walk in the hall and kind of talk, kind of look at their gait and things like that and ask them, hey, are you, with their parents are not there, are you enjoying playing? Like, do you like what you're doing? And a lot of times these kids will be like, no, I don't want to play, or I'm not enjoying it. So I think those are things. And then also I think when you start getting multiple musculoskeletal complaints that aren't structural, that's when I get a little bit more worried. One of the signs for burnout is like they're not sleeping well, they're in pain all the time, they're fatigued. So there are these other soft signs that can be a sign that they're burnt out. Or, one of the things I ask them, and I'll ask the kid, and so is the parent, like, when's the next when's your next season? What are you shooting to get back for? And a lot of times the kids are like, whatever, I don't know, but then the parents like, yeah, they've got soccer starting in July 15th or things like that. So I think when there's this disconnect between how engaged the parents are versus how engaged the kids are, that's when I think the burnout potentially is there. Yeah.
So then in looking at these other sports, Brian, you brought it up earlier that there are some sports that benefit from early sports specialization. So the Olympics are coming up soon, but like gymnastics is clearly one of those examples. And if you have that young athlete who, is performing at that near elite level, and, to get to that higher point, they really have to go in that direction. Like, how do we balance that for these, pre-adolescent, adolescent athletes in those types of sports? Brian, what do you think the right approach there is?
Well, you don't really. I mean, but you're talking about the 0.00001% of gymnasts, rhythmic gymnasts, even figure skaters no longer fall into this category. They are usually adults now. For the most part, or 17, 18, so they can start specializing in high school. So it's so few sports. The problem is that you've developed this machine that youth sports has become an industry. It's $1 billion industry that coaches, private coaches, showcases suggest that everybody needs to specialize early. So the Olympic sports which are all the exception to the rule, all make it seem like you have to specialize early. Now, some of them make it seem like you may need to. The ones that come up consistently, swimming hasn't been proven. Most swimmers can start specializing in high school and do absolutely fine. They won't get really good until 15, 16, 17. Even female swimmers will get really good 15, 16 at the earliest. So you don't need to specialize any earlier than that. Other than that, there aren't too many sports. The other one that used to be brought up a lot was tennis, and tennis did the complete about face around the Andre Agassi, Jennifer Capriati era, which they actually prohibit the ability to specialize early, and they limit the number of hours you can participate early on because they were having so many youth tennis players burn out early. So tennis has done a great job in being able to block that.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so switching gear a little bit. So one of the things that we've talked about recently is baseball pitchers, UCL injuries, and then how youth sport exposure impacts that. Nirav, what are your thoughts on our youth baseball machine and how the current structure is affecting pitchers at the highest level?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, the same sort of concepts at baseline are like the specialization, at young age playing baseball year round. But I think in particularly it's for pitchers. Everyone wants to be a pitcher. And I think with all the analytics and all the statistics now, there's this huge emphasis on velocity. And I think that in the past we had, thought maybe it's breaking pitches, throwing kind of curveballs and changeups and things like that. But I think that this emphasis on velocity and throwing fast repeatedly at a young age has really, really led to a lot of these kind of young players getting UCL tears, getting medial condyle fractures. And I think that the emphasis of, look, in order to get scouted, you need to be throwing 100 miles an hour by the time you're 16. And I think that the only way you can throw fast is you have to throw a lot, and you have to throw in a way that places a lot of strain on the groin skeleton. So I think that's where we're starting to see a lot of these kids burn out at an early age, where it's not uncommon to be getting revision UCL by the time you're in college. You tear it once when you're 14 and you tear it again when you're 19. So I think it's both the year-round emphasis as well as this emphasis on velocity that's setting up a lot of these young arms to get these injuries.
Yeah, and I think
I think it was it was old data that you couldn't throw curveballs early, and that turns out to be not true. You can try, you're probably not going to be good at it, but it's volume and strain on your elbow. So the volume is you're pitching too much and you're pitching too hard. That's the strain. So it's not what you're pitching, it's how much and how hard you're pitching. And that's, I think that the science is there. Jimmy Andrews and his group at American Sports Medicine Institute has shown that. And we really need to limit not only the number of in-game pitches, but the showcases and the off-season pitching and the in the backyard pitching all need to be limited. That being said, it's hard to compete against the machine because there's so much information out there. And for a kid that hears so-and-so had Tommy John surgery and then comes back and then is pitching just as well, what they don't hear is that these are the exceptions. It's not the rule. Most kids that have Tommy John surgery in high school don't pitch again. They come back and then they become a second baseman, or they come back and they don't play baseball anymore because it was a 15-month recovery and they were a junior and then they miss senior season and then they just go off to college. You're the exception that you play if you get a Tommy John in high school. You are not the rule. But you don't hear about the failure stories. You just hear about the success stories in the newspaper or online.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's also like that aspect in baseball, and then it's pretty similar in the other professional sports where we see, like running backs in football accumulating large number of carries and then, their career ending, pretty early. And then Nirav, in the NBA, you've done a number of studies looking at like cumulative load, the effect of multi-sport athletes, like a lot of interesting papers, and hopefully we can put those in the show notes if people are interested in reading those. But what have you seen, and how does this concept of like sports diversification, not specializing too early, how does that impact athletes later on in their careers?
Yeah, and I think if you look, particularly in NBA players, because I think there's so much out there, kind of on the internet and social media, you're taking the elite athletes, and people will say, well, a lot of these people who play multiple sports, it's, and they do well is just because they're just good athletes, right? So, but even when you look at the elite group of athletes, if you look at NBA players who played multiple sports in high school versus those who didn't, those who played multiple sports will typically play more games. They'll be able to cover more distance or kind of quote unquote have more load during their seasons. They'll have better performance. I think we've seen all those various things kind of hold true in terms of what we look at, in terms of the benefits of specialization, even in an elite group. We also did a similar study looking at NFL quarterbacks, and we looked at NFL quarterbacks who were multi-sport versus single sport athlete. And the ones who played multiple sports were more likely to have better statistics, more likely to be MVPs, more likely to kind of do well and have a kind of a better career than those who played single sport. So I think in general, this whole argument that, well, I'm going to play, people play multiple sports and are better at it is because people who are playing multiple sports are just better athletes. I don't think that necessarily holds true. The fact is that even in people who are the highest level of athletes, playing multiple sports has a benefit as opposed to a single sport. So I think the data holds true from, the 8-year-old all the way up to the Bronny James, who's, obviously, kind of the son of an elite athlete. I think it's all data's there. It's very strong.
The newest Los Angeles Laker.
Yes.
That's Dalton Knecht. I think the other thing is when you think about where this came from, it's fascinating. So a lot of this data came from when Malcolm Gladwell, gifted writer, great podcaster, wrote the book Outliers. And he talked about this 10,000 hour rule. And he talked about Tiger Woods and how he became a golfer by specializing in golf from age 2. And they show the clip of him on the I'm blanking on the Tonight Show with him as a 2-year-old. Obviously Tiger Woods not the best success story anymore, but prior to Tiger Woods, people were always multi-sport athletes. But then there was this transition to a 10,000 hour rule, and that's where you needed success and mastery over your domain. And the data on this was not for athletes. The data on this was originally in cigar rollers and musicians. And then this was transformed into, this is what you need for everything. So it was for whether this was physicians, whether this was athletes, whether swimmers, basketball, you needed to get to this magical 10,000 hours. And in order to get to this 10,000 hours, you needed to start at about age 6 to age 16 to get to 10,000 hours if you were actually going to school and participating after school, and you had to exclude other sports. So that was the only way you could get there and also then be able to get a Division I scholarship. So that's where this came from, even though there was no initial data. And then when you looked backwards, some of those kids made it and said, well, it's because I did 10,000 hours worth of activities. And Tiger Woods would say things like, well, it was the 10,000 hours I did in golf. Maybe, But we don't know how Tiger Woods would be doing now if he had also played soccer in high school. He might still be playing. He might not have had everything else go on in his life. So we never know these success stories, how they would have been if they had also been doing other things as well.
Yeah, and I think that idea of Tiger Woods. There's that book Range by David Epstein, which is
Right.
a great book. But that one starts with that discussion of the Tiger Woods versus Roger Federer, and Tiger was hyper focused from a very young age, golf, golf, golf all the time, and then Roger Federer was spread out amongst a number of different sports and just kind of sampling and trying everything, and then eventually settled on tennis, and just kind of showing that both paths can get there. But he argues that that wider, diverse approach is better. Like this, in line with kind of what we're talking about, that those risks of being too focused in one direction is not always beneficial. So that one's definitely worth a read if people have not come across that one. And then Brian, so I think you have a paper coming out soon on like load management, and I think that really ties into like the sport specialization. Just it's like, is that done at an early level or later? But how does like the multi-sport part growing up seem to influence later performance?
Well, I think that's a little bit of what Nirav touched on, is that the players that played multiple sports are able to not be as load managed in the NBA. They seem to be able to run more distance. They're able to have less time off. But not only that, they are more likely to get awards at a younger age in the NBA. So they're more likely to make the All NBA team. So it's interesting when you look at the data at first, you're like, okay, it's a little bit surprising. So we had a paper that came out in AJSM in 2018, and we found that not too many professional athletes participated in multiple sports in high school, but the ones that were multiple sport athletes participated in more games, experienced fewer major injuries, and then had longer careers than those who participated in single sports. So this was kind of a deeper dive now that we have better analytics. And then what we find in that is, with a deeper dive, is that not only are the multi-sport athletes able to like basically play more, so you're getting more value for them, but they play incrementally better. And that really bore out through every advanced metric. And I don't want to spoil the ending, because this paper is still out for abstracts and out for review. But I think it's one of the best papers Nirav and I have put out, because it really takes all the data and looks at every little individual nook and cranny of player performance in the advanced metrics that the NBA is putting out, like distance traveled on the court. And it really bears out that if the kids that played multiple sports are the better athletes that don't need to be load managed. One thing I wanted to bring up, because I think it's important, and Nirav's done some really good, has really good data on this, but he talks a lot about this, and he's talked about this on other podcasts, and he talks about this in some of the talks that he gives, is the socioeconomic impact of single sport versus multi-sport. So Nirav, I'm just going to make you talk about this a little bit. What is the societal impact of being a single sport athlete and the availability of club sports if you're not rich?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point that kind of gets missed a lot. And I think one of the things that it's happened is that sports participation, which everyone should have access to, what ends up happening with this private model is that you've got basically have clubs, which for some parents can be up to $1,000 a month. The average cost is about $500 per month. So you're thinking somewhere between 6,000 up to 20 to 25,000 if you're on an elite travel team, for parents to basically have access to play sports. Now, at the same time, what's happening is that school-based and recreational programs are disappearing. You don't have daily physical education class. High school teams just don't exist anymore. You don't have recreational programs that are cheap for people. So as a result, what ends up happening, particularly in areas that are socioeconomically disadvantaged, is that you basically have kids who, if they don't have access to club sports, they don't have access to sports anywhere else. And as a result, they get the problems of obesity, high blood pressure, mental health issues. And then you have this other group of kids who have access to club sports. And then what ends up happening is that they get all these overuse injuries, they get these kind of traumatic things and then drop out of sport. So we're hurting kids on both ends. And what we're seeing, is that there's this, we're recognizing this now. So the way we can deal with this, and people always ask me, well, what can we do to get, to help deal with this problem? I mean, part of it's education about the risks of sports specialization, but on the other hand, it's creating more community programs. It's doing more recreational based funding. So if you've got money to donate, or you want to support, you want to coach, it's allowing access to these kind of programs kids who can't necessarily afford sports. So I think it's a huge impact at scholarships, like who's getting scholarships. And unfortunately, the only way you can get a scholarship now is if you play club sports, because this is where the college coaches are. So as a result, you look at the kind of the demographics of who's getting scholarships is people who are upper middle class or making over a certain income level, because their parents can get them to all these tournaments and get all these college coaches. And the kids who need it the most don't have access to it because they can't play AAU, they can't play travel ball. So it's a tremendous impact. And I think that's where, it's forgotten a lot is kids, if you look at sports longitudinally until you're an adult, these kids are kind of dropping out early, not because they're injured, because there's nowhere for them to play, which is a problem.
Yeah, I think those are all really important points. And I think it's such an interesting topic that really hits on so many different levels and different areas. So hope you all enjoyed listening to this week's episode of 6 to 8 Weeks. Check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to subscribe and look for our future episodes. And we will see you then.
Thanks for listening to the UCSF Sports Medicine Podcast, 6 to 8 Weeks, Perspectives in Medicine. What do you think of this topic? Connect with us now. In addition to finding our contact form, you'll also find our social media links and our entire 6 to 8 Weeks episode archive. Help us grow our listenership by liking, subscribing, and sharing everywhere. We're eager to hear from you, and we'll be sending you more great thought-provoking content in less than 6 to 8 weeks.